This kind of thing is a war crime. These kinds of deliberate attacks, both to destroy civilian infrastructure and to indiscriminately kill civilians, both amount to war crimes.
Well, leaders of the G7 group of advanced economies met today and they vowed to continue sending help to Ukraine indefinitely. The group met virtually with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and in a draft statement promised to continue to provide financial, humanitarian, military, diplomatic and legal support. Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, echoed the vitality of the support earlier today.
It is important for all of us that Ukraine wins the battle, the war against the invading Russian forces. Because if Putin wins, that is not only a big defeat for the Ukrainians, but it will be defeat and dangerous for all of us, because it will make the world more dangerous and it will make us more vulnerable for further Russian aggression.
That's Jens Stoltenberg of NATO. Let's talk to Jonathan Marcus, former Defence and Diplomatic Correspondent. Jonathan, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
Jonathan, so what made a particular mark with you on today's G7?
Well, this was a largely symbolic moment. I mean, I think the detailed discussions about particular weapon systems, finances, and so on are being handled in other forums. But I think that phrase, undeterred and steadfast support, I mean, undeterred is interesting because clearly there's been a lot of talk about at least the possibility that Mr. Putin might resort to some demonstration of a nuclear weapon or something. It's very clear from the West that they are not being deterred, that support for Ukraine continues indefinitely. And I think this is, a response in a sense to the Rubicon that was crossed by Mr. Putin himself with both his annexation of the territories in Ukraine and also his decision for a mobilization, really a signal that he is prepared to go as far as it takes. Yeah. And now I think Ukraine's allies in the West are making a similar statement, a similar commitment.
I mean, Jonathan, as you judge it, has the missile attacks and drone attacks on cities and towns across Ukraine that we've seen in the past 24, 48 hours, has that had any effect on the solidity of the alliance behind Ukraine? Was it as solid as it appeared from the rhetoric that we hear in public?
I think it is. I think in some ways it's galvanized support yet again. It's certainly galvanized resistance inside Ukraine itself. I think in detailed terms, there's going to be more discussion of providing advanced air defense systems to Ukraine, and they're shooting down some of the incoming weaponry, but clearly not enough of them. I think we should also be very clear here. I mean, this is not the first time that Ukrainian cities have been hit. We've seen towns and villages devastated by the Russians. And I think it's very clear that you have here a combination of both indiscriminate attacks, weapons dropping out of the sky on civilian habitation, apartment blocks being destroyed and damaged and so on. But you also have, in a sense, very precise attacks, particularly on power generating stations. A spokesman for the Lviv government saying that 4 power stations there had been directly targeted and put out of action by the Russians. And one should stress this kind of thing is a war crime. These kinds of deliberate attacks, both to destroy civilian infrastructure and to indiscriminately kill civilians, both amount to war crimes. There is no possible military reason for such attacks.
And Jonathan, looking at it all through a British lens, how do you read the role and the mission of the British Prime Minister Liz Truss and her administration? Certainly, her predecessor Boris Johnson liked to think he was in the very forefront of keeping the alliance behind Ukraine solid and strong, providing them with more weapons, support, munitions, and all of that sort of thing than other allies. How would you define Liz Truss's position?
Well, I think Britain, it's continuity, really. I mean, for all the one can be cynical and say that with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, there was a good measure of kind of Churchillian self-regard in his posture. But in practical terms, Britain has given a lot of support in practical military terms, in terms of weaponry, but also, of course, the important training operation that is going on in Britain, involving trainers from both here and other allied countries. I think Britain remains an important military player amongst the rest. I mean, remember, when I say the rest, the overwhelming bulk of weaponry and support is coming from the United States. But amongst other countries, Britain, certainly in value terms, is high up there in the rankings. If you actually look at it perhaps in terms of proportion of GDP that's being given to Ukraine, Britain perhaps could do considerably more. We're a bit more middling in that table. Countries like the Baltic republics and Poland are giving a more significant share of their national wealth to help Ukraine. Of course, this goes back to perhaps to what you were discussing just before me. Our economic situation is not the greatest, but we are a very important ally, a very important bulwark of support for Ukraine in the alliance. And one assumes with Prime Minister Liz Truss, this is simply going to continue. It's something that's shared on all sides of the mainstream political spectrum here.
Jonathan Marcus, former Defence and Diplomatic Correspondent, thank you.